Miss Simmons had perfectly mauve nails, oval, and she tapped them against the desk while she talked. No drugs, and no alcohol, and no men. Tap. Counseling was available. Tap. Every resident must actively seek employment. Ava should sign up at the job center by the end of the week. Failure to follow the regulations strictly would result in immediate termination of their stay. No questions asked. Tap, tap.
You just heard Ayana Mathis reading from her latest novel, The Unsettled, a story of precarity and family legacy which shifts between a fictional town in Alabama and the Philadelphia of the 1980s. Well, the book's now been translated into French as Les Égarés, and Ayana's going to tell us more about it. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, the passage you just read from features Ava Carson. Now, she's one of your protagonists. She's being assigned a housing solution at that time. She's in a tricky time in her life. Tell us about Ava and her background and where she finds herself.
Sure. So she's in a homeless shelter in Philadelphia. The book is set in 1985. She comes from this place in Alabama that you mentioned called Bonaparte, kind of a mythical settlement on a bend in the Alabama River, which is sort of unprecedented in U.S. history in a certain way because it is a free Black town. For various reasons, partially estrangement from her mother, Ava has left this place. She finds herself in Philadelphia. She has a son there. His name is Toussaint. And Ava and her son live a very pillar-to-post kind of a life. They are the unsettled, in a certain way, of the title. And in many ways, Ava is looking for something that echoes or somehow recreates the strangeness and the singularity of this place that she left. She doesn't find it. In her search, however, she gets herself into quite a few difficult situations. When we meet her in that passage, she's essentially just blown up her marriage. She has no safety net. She has no resources, which is both about her own role as a self-saboteur in her own life, but it's also about the times, this mid-1980s moment in the United States when there were very few social safety nets economically and otherwise for people in trouble. So Ava and her son land in this homeless shelter.
And you mentioned that she finds herself in difficult situations, self-sabotaging, perhaps. I wanted to bring that up because it's easy to respect her and her actions, but not necessarily easy to like her all the time during the book. And as her creator, that must have been quite difficult to strike that balance, bring these different facets of her personality in. How do you build a character like Ava?
Building characters is different for everyone that you make. This book took almost 10 years, and part of the 10 years was Ava's fault. She was just a very difficult character in some ways because I think I judged her, She's easy to respect, as you say, but she's not always easy to like. So she was a character that took a long time because I had to first hear her voice, which was very difficult. And part of the reason that I had trouble hearing her is that I think my own judgments of her were serving as a kind of static that were tuning her out. So I couldn't hear her. So she took quite a long time. The trick with her, I think, is to, and for me with characters in general, is not so much that I need to make a character that's likable in the traditional sense, but that I do need to make a character that's full. This is a full person with varying aspects, including her flaws, including her proclivities, including her love, all of that. So the goal is always fullness, building a character that's full, as opposed to necessarily building a character that's likable in the traditional sense.
And you mentioned that precarity that Ava and Toussaint find themselves in. They're victims of so many oppressive factors that many Black people at that time, perhaps even today, fall into: poverty, failing infrastructure, institutionalized racism. This was happening in the 1980s in Philadelphia. I know that you grew up there, so you know it well.
Yes.
How did things get to that point? And do you think they've improved since then?
I think they got to that point. The 80s, I set this book in the 80s for a couple of reasons, one of which is perhaps a bit too long to get into. But the other one is that, you're coming out of this period of great sort of hope and social upheaval in the 1960s and 70s. It's a difficult period, right? We know, the women's rights movement, the Black Power and civil rights movement, all of these things happened. The Vietnam, war protests, all of that is going on all over the world, but in the United States very particularly. So, but it's also a time in which it seems as though maybe a window is opening, some kind of hopefulness for what might come. And then we get to 1980. Ronald Reagan gets elected. The entire zeitgeist changes. We go from thinking communally and collectively about a collective future to individualism, money, 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 Wall Street, Wall Street, Wall Street. So this window of hope kind of snaps shut. And at the same time that it's doing that, there are also all of these political changes that are happening. Social programming is disappearing. Cultural programming is disappearing. All these kinds of things that go along with that zeitgeist change that comes in after Reagan is happening. And so in many ways, I wanted this book to also show how those things might affect individual people, characters, on the level of how they're living their lives every day. Do I think it's changed? Yeah. I mean, to some extent, but there are still so many problems. I mean, a lot of the things that this book eventually gets into are things like police violence against Black people, etc. You know, it's a book about the ways in which the mainstream market economy leaves certain people out. Those things really, sadly, are still the same.
And the title of the book is so evocative. Your characters are physically unsettled, psychologically so at times as well. But I think that readers might feel unsettled as well by encountering some of their voices. Was that your aim, to unsettle the person reading this?
A little bit. I mean, the biggest aim always is to move people, right? Like my biggest hope is that people empathize with these characters. I think there's a child in this novel named Toussaint, Ava's son, who I think is a great point of empathy and attachment for readers.
Child.
He really is, right? He's deeply precocious. He's kind of quiet. He's very intelligent. He has adult problems way before he should have them. And so what I also hope is at the same time that readers encounter the difficult path that these characters find themselves on, I hope that what they also encounter is some laughter, some moments of joy, some moments even of transcendence in the midst of difficult circumstances.
Now, one of your major characters in the book as well is Cassius Wright. Now, he's a follower of the Black Panther movement, both ideologically and in his actions. We've recently seen some high-profile films, TV series, graphic novels revisiting that political movement and what it meant for American politics and society. How do you see the movement's legacy today?
You know, it's very interesting. I keep going back to this 80s obsession that I seem to have. But one of the things that I was interested in setting this book in the 80s was because that is, as I said, the sort of demise or at least the incredible damage sustained to some of these movements, including the Black Panther Party. So a guy like Cass, who was a Black Panther, finds himself disillusioned. He thinks, well, we did all of this and it didn't work. And so he finds himself sort of creating this utopic-like community, or attempting to, because of what he understands as sort of the failures of some of those movements. And I think that in the United States right now, what you're seeing is the aftermath of the dissolution and infiltration, I think I should also say, on the part of the government, the FBI, et cetera, of some of these freedom movements who certainly had their flaws, certainly had things that we might argue with or might be less than ideal, but at the same time were perhaps showing us some alternatives to the way that things could be in the United States. Those threads still exist. Certainly, you know, things like the Black Lives Matter movement, many of the Native peoples movements that exist in the United States, women's rights, etc. People are still fighting for all of these things. But I guess what has happened is that it seemed as though there was a certain kind of momentum that picked up again a little bit in 2008, you know, during the Obama years. And then, well, we know what happened in 2016, and we know what we're all a little nervous will happen again very soon.
Well, speaking of the political status quo, America's preparing for an election which could see the first Black woman elected president. Do you think the country is there yet? Are they ready for this?
You know, it's very interesting. I can't tell. So my answer in some ways is I don't know. But because of her opponent, and because he poses such a particular kind of threat, I certainly people are talking about the fact that she's a Black woman, but it's almost as though her identity, the specifics of her identity, are somehow dwarfed by the outsized nature of the threats that her opponent poses on one side. So I'm sort of speaking from my kind of left Democrat side. On the right, I don't know. I can't tell if she loses, which I really hope she doesn't. If she loses, I can't tell if it'll be because she's a black woman or if it's because there was so much loyalty to Trump on the Republican side that would be what would create the victory. I don't know. It's a strange moment. In another year, I would say, oh, yes, America is ready or America isn't ready. But this election is so particular because of the particularity of Trump that I think it's hard to tell.
Yeah. Well, going back to the book, The Unsettled won the Gabe Hudson Prize for a second novel, very particular challenge. And your first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was a New York Times bestseller. It had great success, even championed by Oprah Winfrey and her book club. I believe she gave you a phone call to tell you how much she loved the book. What is it like picking up the phone to Oprah Winfrey?
It's kind of surreal. Honestly, it feels like that whole thing happened to someone else. Like it's so odd and obviously unprecedented in my life up to that point, and I imagine ever after, that it almost feels as though it happened to someone else. I mean, I do remember when she called that, she said, oh, this is Oprah Winfrey, and I said, no, it isn't. And we had to do that twice. She said, no, it's Oprah Winfrey, and I was like, no, it's not. And then we got going, but yeah, quite a shock.
Well, we all know that Oprah Winfrey has excellent taste. Ayana Mathis, thank you so much for joining us today. We're wrapping up the show with an exhibition from artist Amy Sherrill, the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Sherrill's known for her striking large-format portraits, which challenge received ideas about colour and race, work that attracted the attention of First Lady Michelle Obama and resulted in an iconic portrait. We'll leave you with a preview of that show. Otherwise, do check in with us here on Arts 24 next time. There's more news coming up just after this.